Generate the square root function that is the inverse of the quadratic function g of x equals negative 1/3 times the quantity 2x minus 1.2 squared minus 0.7 when its domain is restricted to 0.6 is less than or equal to x is less than infinity. Okay, so the first step is to replace g of x with our variable y. So we can write the same equation but with y on the left side. The next step, because we're looking for the inverse function, is to reverse the dependent and independent variable y and x. So instead of y, we'll just put x. The rest of the equation is the same. Okay, well, that is a y there. All right. So going on, now we need to isolate y so that we can get our equation in standard form. So we are going to solve this. Going from the outside in, I'm going to do reverse order of operations first, getting rid of this 0.7 by doing the opposite operation, adding it, and adding it on the other side. So then we have x plus 0.7 equals negative 1/3 times 2y minus 1.2 squared. Okay, so we still have this negative 1/3 in front that's being multiplied. To get rid of that, or to cancel it, we can just multiply by the reciprocal, negative 3. And making sure to multiply it by both terms on the other side. So we're left with negative 3 times x plus 0.7 equals, and then negative 1/3 times negative 3 multiplies to 1. So that's why that cancels. It'll just be 1 multiplied in front, which just leaves us with 2y minus 1.2 squared. Okay, so for simplicity's sake, let's go ahead and distribute the left side. So negative 3 times x is negative 3x, and negative 3 times 0.7 will give us minus or negative 2.1. And you can do that in a calculator or by hand, but that's how we get the negative 2.1. And then we still have the same thing on the other side. Okay, so now we need to deal with this exponent. So the reverse operation there is a square root. That will go ahead and cancel the second exponent, and then we need to make sure to square out the other side. So the square root and the power 2 cancel. We're just left with what's underneath, 2y minus 1.2. And on the left side, that's going to have a plus or minus. And that's because when you take the square root of something, two positives can multiply to a positive, and two negatives also multiply to a positive. That's why there's two answers there. It could be two negatives or two positives. That will still give you, when it's squared, it'll still give you a positive answer. So let's keep going and keep solving for y on our right side. I will add 1.2 to move it to the other side. All right, so for more space, I'm just going to rewrite our answer up here. So we have plus or minus the square root of negative 3x minus 2.1 plus 1.2 equals 2y. And finally, to get y alone, since it's multiplied by 2, we can divide by 2. Those cancel. Make sure to divide by 2 on the other side. All right, so we're left with y equals plus or minus square root of negative 3x minus 2.1 plus 1.2 all divided by 2. Now that doesn't look very pretty. We don't love a fraction that goes across the whole entire equation. So let's try to simplify this a little bit. On the first one, well, we first know that we can rewrite this equation so that the square root of negative 3x minus 2.1 divided by 2 and plus 1.2 divided by 2, that those can be split up. And then instead of putting a 2 on the bottom, a little nicer way to write that is just by multiplying by 1/2 in front. And then simplifying these numbers, plus, well, 1.2 divided by 2 will give us 0.6. Okay, so we have our equation now. Let's look. It also showed us that the domain is restricted here. So looking at that, well, we know that our x has to be greater than or equal to 0.6 or less than infinity. So basically that just tells us x has to be positive. That's the really important thing, what it tells us there. Has to be positive numbers. So when we're deciding, do we need the positive or negative version of this equation? Well, since our domain is positive, we know that we are going to use the positive version. We don't need the negative version. So we know that part. And then the other thing we need to consider is that we need to put this back into the inverse notation, inverse function notation. So we can rewrite y as g inverse of x. So that leaves us with our final answer, which will be g inverse of x equals 1/2 times the square root of negative 3x minus 2.1 plus 0.6.